This episode is going to cover so much about the legal side of podcasting. I cannot wait for you to listen. So last week, my guest, Alicia Kumar, talked about how she just got her trademark for her podcast. And so I thought you guys should know more about the legal side of podcasting. So I brought in my friend, Gordon Firemark. Gordon is literally the podcast lawyer, so there's no better person to talk about this. Now, in this episode, we're going over the basics of what you need to know about the legal side of podcasting, but there is so much more to it. If you have specific questions, make sure you go and check out Gordon's website and contact him there. He also has a ton of resources for podcasters, so make sure you go connect with him, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe, where we're serving up everything you need to know about podcasting, from tips, stories, and strategies for podcasters from podcasters. I'm your host, Haley Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency helping business owners, creatives, and thought leaders launch and grow their shows. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your podcast to the next level, this is the place for you. Each week, we'll dive into practical tips, actionable strategies, and of course, stories from other podcasters so that you can build up a podcast that you love and that works for your business. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. Hey, Gordon, I am so thrilled to be talking with you today in the Podcast Cafe. Thanks for joining me.
Haley, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. It's been a while since we have talked last. You were actually one of my first podcast guests on my other podcast, Employee to Boss. And, you know, we talked about the legal side of podcasting and all of that on there. So I'm excited to have you back as one of my first guests on this new podcast.
Well, it's exciting, and I love the sound of my own voice, so let's have some fun.
Well, since we are in the Podcast Cafe, I have a very important question for you. What is your go-to coffee order?
I don't have a go-to coffee order. Right now I'm drinking English breakfast tea, but that's because I have a little scratchy throat. Usually I'm a Diet Coke guy.
Diet Coke works for this.
Yeah.
Awesome. So my first question for you is, you have all these various podcasts, and I want to talk about, you know, all the podcasts that you've started and continue to have over the past 16 years. Like, I don't know anyone else with a podcast that's been around for 16 years. So I'd love for you to describe maybe your podcast or your podcast journey in 3 words.
Wow, in 3 words, the journey. Well, let me tell you about the 2 podcasts that I currently have active.
Yeah,
I've had
definitely.
others over the years, but Entertainment Law Update is 3 words, and I think it speaks for itself. It really tells you exactly what you get when you listen in. It's aimed at other lawyers in the entertainment field and you know, folks who have a geeky interest in what's going on in the courts and the legislation and things like that impacts the entertainment media industries. I've been an entertainment lawyer for about 32 years now, and I started that podcast. That was the early on show that I started in 2009 as a marketing tool for the podcast, for the practice, I should say, and it's worked out real well. We'll talk more about that. The other show is called Legit Podcast Pro, and it is about keeping podcasters on the legal side of things. More than 3 words, but just tips and strategies for the creative podcasters, YouTubers, that those kinds of folks who often are running blindly into trouble if they're not careful.
Yeah, that's so easy. I mean, trademarks and just what you can say and what you should say. And so that's really where you can help them out with the legal side of everything. Yeah, and
I'm not saying that they shouldn't, you know, that they should avoid controversy, just that they should avoid legal controversies and stay out of, you know, using other people's music or infringing on brands and names and things like that. And so really my goal is to help creators keep on creating and not have to be distracted by these big headache kinds of problems that can come up.
Absolutely. So why don't you tell us more about your background and really how you got into podcasting 16 years ago?
Okay. Well, I came up, actually, my early background is relevant in a little bit of a way. I got excited and interested in theater when I was very young. At a 5-year-old kindergarten class, went to see a dress rehearsal of the local high school's stage production of Oliver. And I was mesmerized and hooked, and that worked me through into, grade school, middle school. In middle school, I took on and became the sound guy at the school, the nerdy AV club kid. And by high school, I was working on all the school plays, but also professionally in local theaters, mainly as a sound technician. And started college thinking I was going to be in theater, and that moved me into film and television and that arena. And really my aptitude for the legal and business side of things didn't really show its head until I was about a senior in college, and I had a professor pull me aside and say, "You should think about going to law school." And I thought that was hilarious. But a year or so later, the Writers Guild was on strike. I was trying to work in Hollywood, and there was no work. So, okay, I'll go to law school. And became a lawyer with a very clear intent of going into entertainment, which meant I was hard to employ, hard to find a job and that kind of thing. So I ended up hanging out my own shingle very quickly. I was only in practice for about a year when I left the job I was in, and I started seeing my own clients, and that's over 30 years ago now, 31 years. So about halfway through that, I started doing an email newsletter and a blog as a marketing strategy for my practice. And this is before blog was even a term that people used, but that database-driven website kind of thing. And even that it felt like a lot of work to write, constantly writing content and so on, and sort of being comfortable just talking. When I discovered this thing called podcasting, 2005, 2006, I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I started listening, of course. Got invited to be a guest on a few shows, and that clinched it. So this was going to be my strategy.
Yeah. And what's kept you going for the past 16 years? I mean, like I was saying, I don't know any other podcasts that have been going consistently for 16 years. So really, how do you keep going with all of it?
That's a great question. A lot of it is I'm just a stick-to-itiveness kind of a guy. Once I start something, I'm determined to see it through. And maybe not always in my best interest to stick with things. Sometimes you should quit when things aren't working. But for me, it's also fun, and it's sort of both a hobby and a business thing. And I think it makes me a better lawyer, keeping up with what's going on in the entertainment law world, and then sharing it with my colleagues through the podcast. It has positioned me really well. So every time I think about maybe stopping or maybe, suspending things for a while, I know it's too much fun. I'm going to keep going. So
yeah. Over the past 16 years since you started, really, what shifts have you seen in the podcast world? I know that's such a big question. I got started like 7-8 years ago in this industry, and I've seen so much change, and you've been double the time that I have.
So back in 2009, when we launched Entertainment Law Update, we were just at the point where my first few episodes, I actually hand-coded that RSS feed. I had to learn XML code in order to put it on the website, so it could be distributed. And then WordPress came along, and that was a really easy way. Actually, it had been around for a while, but it was a really easy way to generate that RSS feed from the enclosures and the stuff that we all do pretty simply now. So that's the big change. The technological playing field is so much more level than it's ever been. That's great. Sound quality's up. Everybody's got bandwidth now. Back then, you had to download the episodes onto your iPod, your iPod, excuse me. Mm-hmm. And, you'd carry it around from place to place and listen on your earphones or maybe plug it into your car. We didn't have all the bandwidth and the internet connectivity that we have now that makes it, streamable and access anywhere kind of thing. So that's a big, big change. You used to have to tell people, I have a podcast, here's what you have to do. And you'd go through a 7-step procedure to get access and listen to the show. And now it's go to this app on your phone and type this in. So it's super easy. And that's great. It's been good for the medium.
Wow. I cannot even imagine trying to do some coding to get a podcast up and running. I never even thought about that. I guess when I jumped in, there was already, various streaming platforms, and it was easy. I mean, it's easier now than ever.
Oh, yeah.
But there's also more resources now than ever to make it easy. So really, when you were starting, it probably was a lot of like, okay, who do I know that has a podcast and how can I ask them questions?
Yeah, I actually followed a guy who had started up, a guy named Cliff Ravenscraft started a podcast himself. He had at one time he had 40 shows or something like that, but he did something called the Podcast Answer Man, and each week he would talk about the technical side, and here's what you do, and here's how you get this set up, and recommendations of microphones. And fortunately, I had that sound background also, so I knew how to record, but getting it published was the challenge. And but this is before YouTube was a great resource for those kinds of things. Nowadays, that's where you go when you're looking for an instruction manual, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. No, that's so good. So what, when we think about the legal side of podcasting, it is kind of one of those, it seems like the wild, wild west to a lot of people of like, oh, there's rules around this, or what can I do? What do I need to do? Trademarks. So I really want people to go and listen to your show to learn more about the in-depths of the legal side of podcasting, but it would be amiss if we didn't chat a little bit about it on this show.
Right. Okay, so the legal side for me, that my show that covers that is the one called Legit Podcast Pro, just to be really clear about that. I mean, it's right. People don't think that there's much to it. And to a certain extent, I'll say it's really simple till it gets really complicated. So you don't want to ever go where it gets complicated. And the way you do that is following a few simple rules. Don't use other people's stuff without their permission, whether that's music or the title of the show or a graphic image or those kinds of things. There's copyright and trademark law issues. If you're going to be talking about real people, make sure you either get it right and it's entirely truthful, or you don't say anything that is disparaging or harmful to reputations, those kinds of things. Privacy is another concern. Please don't hide microphones and interview people without them knowing they're being interviewed. It happens. You'd be amazed.
Wow.
And, the getting consent from your guests to come on the show is always an important thing, so they don't have any, hard feelings later if they want you to take it down, if they don't like them. You have those conversations in advance rather than at the end, and those kinds of things. Yeah, but there's lots to it. The trademark stuff tends to be the sticky stuff these days. Yeah. People choosing to, as there get to be millions of podcasts. When I started, there were a few hundred podcasts in the world. And now we've got millions, and people are stepping on each other by choosing titles that are similar enough to be confusing. And that's the big no-no in that arena. So
yeah, definitely. Trademarks and all of that. And I have some people come to me and they're like, oh, I want to start a podcast under this name. And I encourage them to go look it up because there's so many other podcasts with that name. But normally whenever I get a legal question, I'm like, please go talk to Gordon. I don't know.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yes. No, I've sent lots of people over to you because that's the truth. I don't know. I'm not I'm not a legal expert in any stretch of the imagination.
The other thing that is a common friction point, I guess, among podcasters is the relationship when people are working together as a team to make a show, whether they're co-hosts, co-producers, whatever. Relationships don't always last. And it's really important that, again, early in the relationship, you have the conversations about those kind of scary, nasty, what if this happens, what if that happens. I call it a podcast prenup. And it's really the idea of, getting on paper a plan for if and when the relationship doesn't continue. Who gets to keep the house and kids, and that audience is the kids, really.
Yeah.
You don't want to just bail on an audience and leave them wondering what happened to so and so. So having a plan for how you're going to deal with those kinds of things, an exit strategy, a buyout strategy, something that can be really important also.
Yeah, yeah. When I first started my first podcast, I was back in college and I was doing it with a friend. We were co-hosts, and there was a point when I moved up to Seattle. I'm from Las Vegas originally, and this was before virtual recording was as easy as it is today. And honestly, I loved working with her, but the topic I was just losing interest in. And so I was like, I really don't want to do this anymore. Do you want to do it by yourself? And she's like, yeah, I would love to. And she still does the podcast to this day. But that was an easy split between us because I was like, you're way more passionate about this. Keep going. But I do hear stories all the time of just the show dissolving because there is no resolution to it at all.
Yeah, I mean, when one of you is losing interest, it's sort of easy to just say, I'm going to just step away. It's yours. Go do it. The problem is when you both love it, but you don't love each other.
Yeah.
So I'm out and you're out too. I'm going to take it and do it. And then you're fighting over who owns the name, who owns the RSS feeds, those kinds of things. So better to try to handle that first up front.
Yeah, like one of the most public, I would say, podcast divorces of these times is Call Her Daddy. And I'm sure you've heard all about that split between, you know, Alex and Sophia. But when that was happening, people were bought in.
Right.
And people were like, well, what's going to happen? How is this going to work?
The real podcasters of South whatever. The story, they became the story for a while, which, you know, may be okay with you, but maybe it's not. So
Yeah.
Interesting.
No, so for anyone who's thinking of starting a podcast, go check out Gordon's resources. I mean, I always send people to your podcast release, guest release download, because it is important to have that. You know, I've had clients before that record episodes and they're not as pre-recorded as I would like them to be.
Right.
And then a guest is like, actually, can you not release that? Or, you know, and they have to because they don't want to. Well, I mean, they don't have to, but they're good people, so they do.
Well, you know, what do you do when you have a sponsorship commitment where you were supposed to put out an episode every week and then suddenly one's getting pulled from the rotation? Then maybe you're breaking your contract with your sponsor for that. You know, they were expecting this promotion to happen at this time. So you want to make sure that you have that, like I said, like you said, that guest release, podcastrelease.com is the home for that. And it is really that consent to record and distribute and, you know, basically a promise that they're not going to ask you to take it down. That doesn't mean you can't if you feel like it's the right thing to do, or you could get in and edit it, but you don't have to. You don't want those decisions in the hands of your guests. You want them in your hands as the host. And that's really my big crusade, is everybody should get their release signed. And it's a freebie. It's how you get into my universe and hear more about my stuff. So podcastrelease.com.
Yeah. Okay, I'll put that in the show notes along with, you know, the Legit Podcast Pro podcast, because there's a lot of value for all podcasters to go check that out and make sure that what they're doing is legal and legit, just like in your title. I want to get back to, you know, how you promote your podcast, because you have to, and you do have a leg up on the competition of other, you know, podcasts about podcasting, because you do have this legal background and you do have these expertise, and it feeds directly into your offers. So there is a pretty clear through line of someone has a legal question, they land on your podcast, and then they're like, oh my God, he's the one that's going to help me with this. So can you talk about the promotion?
Well, first off, let me say thank you for saying that. It's one of those things where when you're a solo business owner and you're out there doing this stuff, the feedback doesn't come that, oh, okay, so people do actually see that through line. It's working. I appreciate that.
Of course.
How do I promote my, entertainment law update? When we first started, again, this was a new thing. We had to tell people what a podcast was before we could tell them about our podcast. And it was really a word of mouth game. I mean, my co-host and I were both active on Twitter, so we used that a lot. Again, 2008, 2009, 10, it was pretty early. But we knew there was a lot of lawyers, simpatico mindsets that were there, so we figured that was a good place to start. And we advertised paid ads in legal publications, legal newspapers and magazines here and there, especially when we had a good, really solid episode. We'd try to get people listening that way, but mostly word of mouth. Hey, Mom, tell all your friends,
Yeah.
I don't think my mom ever told any of them. To this day, I don't think she's ever listened to an episode of my shows. And it's not her interest area, so...
Yeah.
But yeah, with Legit Podcast Pro, it's a little different because I was doing some live video streaming on YouTube and Facebook before I started it as a podcast. And I really went from live stream to audio first live stream, I guess is how I'll describe it, where I sit here just like you're seeing me today, and I'm doing it live to camera, but I'm thinking of it as an audio recording. So I'm recording the content with the listener in mind, and then it just happens to be on YouTube as well. Well, YouTube has been great for discoverability. Yeah. It's one of the things that I think where podcasting is at a disadvantage is that there is no algorithm because there are so many different hosts and so many different syndications and different ways of getting a podcast to come to your listening world that there's no one place to find all the data about what else I might be interested in. If we could fix that in podcasting, I would say it'll be explosive. And YouTube is probably the way that happens right now. But we also, I have tried some paid advertising in that arena as well. There's an outfit, I'm not going to name names, but there's an outfit that you can, for a few $100 you can get a guaranteed number of impressions basically on other podcasts. And that's worked out pretty well. But for me, I would say one of the best ways to get more attention, more traffic to my show has been to go on other people's shows like this one, where your listeners may find something interesting that I said or find me amusing or laughable or whatever and want to sort of, okay, what's he going to do next? That kind of thing. Yeah. And that's how, it's slow. It's not, you can't expect to get 1 million people all at once. You just have to, hopefully you get 2 and they told 2 friends and so on and so on and so on.
Exactly. And that's also the power of having like a niche podcast like yours is if someone has a question about the legal side of podcasting, they're like, oh, you have to listen to this podcast. Like it's the number one that I would recommend. And, another thing is just with the evolution of the podcast world, I find that a lot of people come to me and they're like, I didn't even know there were such things as podcast managers. Fair. Understandable if they're not in this world. But it's the same thing with you. I'm sure you hear, I had no idea that there was a lawyer for podcasts.
Well, I count it as a blessing that there's really only a handful of us. Yeah. There was a time when I could say I was the only one. And having more of us means that there's more work for all us to do also. But that is definitely a thing. Another thing about the discoverability, I'll just say, YouTube and Google are so closely affiliated. I mean, they're owned by the same parent company. YouTube results show up in your Google results. And so I'm not saying you have to do complicated video, but having your show and the keywords and the descriptions on YouTube means that when people go looking for what do I do about this, or how do I get a music license for my podcast to use that AC/DC song, they're going to find me because I'm talking about that stuff on YouTube and also publishing it on my blogs and things like that. So it's really a sort of be everywhere kind of a strategy, I would say. Yeah.
I noticed that you are really active in Facebook groups for podcasters as well. And I'm sure this goes and helps you when you're researching topics to talk about. I mean, people come to me all the time and they're like, how do I come up with episodes every single week? Like, how do I know topics to come up with every single week? And you, having talked about topics for 16 years, you have to get creative with where you're finding this content. So what research aspect goes into your shows?
Well, first off, let me say on the choosing a topic or finding something to talk about, everything old is new again, and the cycle of that is faster and faster. So, even though you talked about something 6 months ago, you can revisit those topics even more often. I mean, I'll tell you, my production schedule for Legit Podcast Pro is I have sort of a group of 6 or 7 sort of parent-level topics that I rotate through. So this week I'm talking about trademarks. Next week I'm talking about those podcast prenups and so on. But I come at it with a different angle on that issue every week. Yeah. So that way there's enough content to sort of keep the hungry engine fed. As far as the research, for me, starting with subject matter knowledge just, burned into my brain is really the essence of it. And again, a lot of what I do is sort of responding to the questions or the things I see as being common discussion points in the social media. That's why I choose to be there as visibly as I am, is because there's so many folks asking questions and raising issues, and it stimulates the thinking. So subject matter knowledge, being an entertainment lawyer, understanding that area. For me, creating that show, Entertainment Law Update, was about, just a keen interest in the subject matter. So I was watching and keeping up with what's going on anyway, and I wanted to talk about this stuff with someone else who was sort of on the same level, not just teaching principles. So it's me and a co-host, and we bat stuff around as case law decisions come out. With Legit Podcast Pro, as I said, it's more of that pick a topic and figure out an angle
Yeah.
And when there is a research question, we lawyers are good at research, so that's part of it too. And then AI comes into play also.
Yeah, I know the role of AI in podcasting has been exploding in so many different ways. And something I always see you talk about on Facebook too is, the importance of having a transcript for your podcast. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. Can you share a little bit about that for podcasters?
Well, I mean, for one thing, so much of our online world is still text-based. So having that transcript with the words that you actually spoke about on the podcast, where it's searchable on the web, is a big plus, or boiled down into show notes or something. But also, we have, there's a community of people, there's people in our community, I should say, who have hearing impairment or visual impairment or whatever. And so, we have a legal and moral, I would say ethical obligation to be accessible to them as much as possible. Now, as small individual podcasters, we don't really have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's an exception for smaller businesses and things, but it's still the right thing to do. And it's become, I won't say trivially easy, but it's very easy to create a transcript. There's lots of tools out there. And then to publish that along with your episode. Some of the hosting services now, you can sort of embed them together and it all comes out as one. And that way folks can get captions, or they can follow along and read the transcript and those kinds of things. And I think that's, if you're not doing that, you're leaving out what may not be a giant audience, but it's a significant chunk of people that's worth reaching.
Yeah. And I know with like Descript or Otter AI, they create easy transcripts. I've really loved everything we've talked about so far. And before we get into my rapid fire section, I'm curious if you have any more tips to share with podcasters from all your expertise.
I mean, doing things right is certainly very important, but it's okay to make mistakes. Doing things because it feels like it's going in the right direction, try things out, experiment. Look, if there's a legal question about it, I don't want you to get into legal trouble, but, be willing to take some risks, be willing to do some experimentation. Not everything is going to pan out the way you want it to, but every no is a lesson. You know what they say? So I'd say just get out and do it, and don't expect perfection from yourself, because it ain't never going to happen.
Yeah, that's so true. And I know when we think about podcasting, like reflecting back on your 16 years, like I'm sure there's been challenges that you've faced, and definitely more wins than that to outweigh the challenges. But I think that making the authenticity part of podcasting is so important, especially in a time now that so many people are starting. And, if you look on Instagram, there's influencers everywhere, and they seem like they have the picture perfect life, and it's just not how it is. So are there any challenges that you want to share that you've overcome through podcasting?
Well, for a while there, I struggled with the imposter syndrome, the feeling of who am I to be teaching other lawyers about this stuff, but I've managed to overcome that one, mostly just ego, probably. Other challenges, growing the shows. It's always a challenge, and trying to figure out what's working and what's not. And I'll say the answer to most of that is listening to the audience, asking questions, doing surveys, asking for feedback. Those are important. How did you hear about us is a great question to ask. And sometimes that surprising answer. I have a friend who has become a friend who came to me because he was following an influencer, and he asked her a question. And she said, I don't know, but there's this guy, Gordon. You should talk to him. And this guy, Mike, and I have now it's been 8 or 9 years. We've been close friends. It started as a mentor-mentee relationship, and now we are business partners and working on an online course and coaching program together and things. So, every adversity is also an opportunity. I guess that's my takeaway.
That's really great advice. Thank you so much for sharing those. So I'm excited to get into this rapid fire section with you. The first one is, what is the first podcast you ever listened to?
I was thinking about this. I think it has to be This Week in Tech with Leo Laporte when he first launched it, which was him and Patrick Norton sitting around doing what they used to do on TV. So
that's awesome. I love that. I like hearing what people, their first intro to podcasting, because I think that has a big impact on us as podcasters. So my second one is, what is your favorite podcast genre to listen to besides your own?
I am hooked on business development, but it's sort of personal growth and development. Most of the business folks I'm listening to are very much about the holistic, heal yourself, get your mindset right, and the business will follow kind of an approach. So self-improvement is part of that too. I follow Colin Boyd, who has a show about public speaking and how to, sell from stage is really his the business that he's promoting. And I never fail to enjoy his episodes.
Yeah, I love those self-improvement podcasts too. I think that's, as business owners, entrepreneurs, that's what really is going to get us to the next level for sure. Do you have a dream podcast guest?
I was thinking about this earlier. I mean, I miss my dad. He's been gone since before I started podcasting. So I would love to have a chance to talk with him on mic and get his impressions of things. He was a physician, so the legal side isn't the thing. I would always love to talk to my dad more than I got to. But if I had to choose a guest, historical figures, I think any one of the, the framers of the American experiment, the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, maybe even King George, to hear what the other side of that story was like for them, and Abraham Lincoln, I think, would be a top pick.
Very cool. I love that. Imagine what they would think about podcasting today.
Man, I've actually sort of kidded around about, can you imagine what Benjamin Franklin would think today of a podcast when, he was flying that kite with a key on the string?
Yeah.
You remember Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure? Do you remember that movie?
Yeah.
And Beethoven playing all the synthesizers in the mall. I just think, what these great minds could have done with the technology we have now, it's amazing to think about what could have been.
It really is. It really is. Oh, those are great answers. Okay, what is one podcast you'd recommend everyone listen to?
Well, Legit Podcast Pro, of course.
Of course.
One podcast I'd recommend everyone listen. I can't remember the name of it. But Marie Forleo is a sort of business coach kind of a person, and she does some great stuff. So anything Marie is on, I think, is great.
My next question is, what is your favorite podcast listening platform?
I listen in my car. I use the Overcast app, which hasn't been updated as much as some of the others. And there's a few things that are, I'm always sort of taking a look at others, but I just come back to Overcast and through CarPlay in my car. And that's where I do most of my listening. I
love that. I mean, I think that's a great answer too, because everyone's like Spotify or Apple, but there are listeners on different platforms. And so when you're setting up your podcast, I feel like a lot of people do just set those two up, but it never always set up all of them.
It's the other side of what I was saying about discoverability and how we don't have that in the podcasting space. And part of the reason I don't use Spotify or iHeart or one of those other apps is I don't want to give them all that data so they can feed me more and more ads.
Yeah.
And so, it's two sides of the same coin.
Definitely. Do you have any podcast listening pet peeves?
Yeah, the long-winded introduction and the chit-chat and the not getting to the point until you're 10 minutes into the show. That's I just won't listen if it's doing that.
Yeah.
Tell me what you're going to tell me, then maybe run an ad if you have to, if that's your business model, and then get into it and tell me.
Yeah.
And then wrap it up and get out and don't waste my time.
No, it's so true. Whenever I'm helping someone start a podcast and they kind of go down that route, I'm like, imagine someone's listening for the first time and it's just you talking about your weekend.
And then I had a tuna fish sandwich.
Right.
And then we went down to the beach and I got sand in my butt crack. Who cares?
Right. Get into it. And then obviously put yourself in it while you're talking about the topic. Yeah. But it doesn't need this long intro. So. And
my co-host Tamara and I on Entertainment Law Update, we're both lawyers and we feel like our listeners are our friends and they do sometimes make a note of the things we chat about. But our chit-chat, I would say we do it in under a minute at the top of the show. And just, hey, how's it going with you? What's new? And sometimes it's just, it's a beautiful day here in L.A. things are great, the kids are in school, and I'm glad to be, whatever. And then we move on. It's okay to be a little human, but that's not why the listeners are there. If they want to know more about that, they can reach out and call me.
Definitely. Awesome. I love that. What's the best advice you've ever received about podcasting?
Best advice I ever received was just do it. Just start. Mm-hmm. And I'll expand on that a little bit. It was just start dirty, ugly, unpolished, because it's going to get better. And when you've only got 10 listeners or 3 listeners, and it's mom and your uncle and your sister and your cousin, they'll be forgiving of an audio glitch or, a rough start or whatever it is. So learn from doing rather than learn from reading and studying, and then you still haven't ever done it. And it'll get better as time goes by. You don't have to worry about what's under the bridge. Nobody started out jumping right from grade school to Broadway. They went through school and studied and learned to act and learned to perform or whatever. So. Exactly.
No, I love that. That's really great advice. My last question for you is, what is the most surprising thing you've learned about yourself through podcasting?
That I like the spotlight more than I ever thought I did.
Ooh, I like that.
I have always been a behind-the-scenes guy. I mean, look, it's what I've, in school doing theater stuff, I was always the sound man behind the, sitting in the back of the room. And I was happy to sort of take the applause as partly for me, even though they were really cheering on the actors. As an entertainment lawyer, most people aren't thinking about who was the lawyer on that great movie I just saw, right? But having the platform of the podcast and being able to say my piece and be a little famous in my audience with my audience, it's a nice feeling. It's warm and mostly fuzzy at the times, and so I guess my ego is getting its fix. God knows my wife and kids don't feed it, so.
It's so funny. Oh my gosh. Well, Gordon, I've absolutely loved everything you've chatted about in this episode. I'm curious, what is next for you and your podcast?
Most of my podcasts have always been sort of directed at capturing attention and driving traffic to my products, either my law practice, position me as an expert, or I offer a course and templates and things like that for podcasters called Easy Legal for Podcasters. And I've built a whole brand called Easy Legal Products or Easy Legal Brands. And so I'm thinking there may be another podcast starting that's more for the digital course creator, entrepreneur kind of folks. And, many of the principles are the same, but people think of themselves in whatever particular category they're in. So I'll probably be doing something aimed at the entrepreneurs.
Oh, I love that. And I think that is so needed because I've seen the conversation around this a lot more recently because people can make any claims that they want online of, download this course, it'll make you $1 million.
Right.
And then they download it like a $17 course. Obviously, that's probably not going to make you $1 million. So I've seen the call for more regulation around claims lately. So I'd be really interested in hearing all about that in a new podcast for sure.
I will keep my eyes on that and we'll see what we can come up with.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Where's the best place for the audience to come and connect with you?
I would say, GordonFiremark.com is sort of a clearinghouse for all of my products and things like that. But if you're just wanting to hear more of what I'm talking about and things, then find Legit Podcast Pro either in your podcast app or on YouTube. Search for me on YouTube. You'll find plenty.
Perfect. I'll put all those links in the show notes, and I'll continue sending everyone who asks me legal questions over to you. I am grateful for this connection. And definitely, I'm just like, go talk to Gordon. Just go talk to Gordon.
Love it. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to take your podcast to the next level. Remember, podcasting is a journey and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Let's connect. Be sure you follow me on Instagram at Espresso Podcast Production or visit espressopodcastproduction.com for more tips, resources, and behind-the-scenes insights. I'd love to hear about your podcasting journey. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling extra generous, I'd love it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more podcasters just like you find the show. Until next time, Grab your coffee, keep creating, and I'll see you back here in the Podcast Cafe.